Hello and welcome to episode 27 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. My name is Steve Elliott. I'm the host at tokesignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. First of all, let's take a look at our bud pick of the week. We have some Ghost Train OG this week from Slappy at Secret Seeds in Seattle. And as you can see, it is a very attractive trichome covered strain. It has some genetics of OG Kush in the family tree. It has some genetics of Trainwreck, and it has some proprietary information in that family tree too. Let me just tell you, it's quite good. Let's do the news now, shall we? This week, Uruguay's president, Jose Mujica, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in legalizing marijuana there in that South American nation. Jose Pepe Mujica has been nominated for this year's Nobel Peace Prize. According to advocates, President Mujica's legalization of marijuana in his country is a tool for peace and understanding. The Drugs Peace Institute, which has supported Mujica's legalization drive since 2012, has endorsed his candidacy. Also endorsing Mujica for the award are members of his left-wing political party, the Frente Amplio, also the Planta to Planta, which is a collective of Uruguayan cannabis growers, and the Latin American Coalition of Cannabis Activists. In late December, Uruguay became the first nation in the modern world to fully legalize the production and sale of cannabis. Under this new law, which comes into effect in April, Uruguayans will be able to buy marijuana at the drugstore, or they'll be allowed to grow their own. President Mujica's stand against the UN-led war on drugs is a symbol of a hand outstretched of a new era in a divided world, according to the Drugs Peace Institute. It is a promise to bridge the gap between defiant marijuana consumers and the prohibiting society. Hopefully, the start of the acceptance of this consumption by society and the concomitant development of understanding of its use as a natural medicine, historically used for spiritual liberation, might initiate a process of healing in a world very confused and deeply divided over its religious legacy, reads the Dutch non-governmental organization's website. The Institute pointed out that unlike cocaine products that reinforce the ego, cannabis has the peculiar quality of diminishing the consumer's ego. I'm very thankful to these people for honoring me, said President Mujica, who has been called the world's poorest president. We are only proposing the right to try another path because the path of repression doesn't work, he said. President Mujica signed the legalization bill into law on December 25th. The government has until April 9th to finalize the regulations controlling the sale and cultivation of marijuana. Adults 18 and older will be allowed to grow up to 6 plants and will also be able to buy up to 40 grams a month at drugstores. To buy cannabis, residents will have to register in a nationwide database that will keep track of how much marijuana they purchase each month. The law will forbid foreigners from buying marijuana in an attempt to undercut the black market price of $1.40 a gram. Government marijuana will be priced at just $1 a gram. Mujica made it into the top 10 finalists for the Nobel Peace Prize last year, too. The 2013 prize, though, was awarded to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. President of Uruguay since 2010, Mujica was once a member of an armed guerrilla group inspired by the Cuban Revolution. The group was called the Tupamaros in the 1960s and 70s. After a military coup in 1973, Mujica spent 12 years in prison. During that time, he was confined to the bottom of a well for more than 2 years. When democracy was restored in 1985, Mujica was freed under an amnesty law. And when he became president in 2010, he pledged to give away 90% of his monthly salary to charities that benefit the poor. Hence his appellation as the world's poorest president. He refuses to live in the presidential palace, and instead he continues to live in his farmhouse. In the United States this week, we have an Oregon congressman blasting a drug official, a White House drug official, for his cluelessness on marijuana. An Oregon congressman on Tuesday blasted the deputy director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, the infamous ONDCP, after failing to get a straight answer to his question about the supposed dangers of marijuana. When Representative Earl Blumenauer, Democrat of Oregon, a friend of the cannabis community for more than 40 years, asked Chief Deputy Drug Czar Michael Botticelli for the number of fatal cannabis overdoses for the past 5 years, Botticelli replied, "To my knowledge, I don't know if there have been instances of specific overdose-related deaths." Representative Blumenauer continued to press Botticelli in the House Oversight Committee hearing, asking him whether marijuana is more dangerous and addictive than cocaine or methamphetamine. "I don't think that anyone would dispute the fact that there's relative toxicity related to those drugs," Botticelli said in a classic political non-answer. Understandably, Representative Blumenauer, who voted to make Oregon the first state to decriminalize marijuana in the United States back in 1973, when he was a state representative in Salem, understandably, he wasn't satisfied with that answer. He asked Botticelli again whether cannabis is more dangerous than those other two illegal drugs, both of which are officially, by the way, Schedule II controlled substances, both officially considered safer by the United States federal government than the drugs on Schedule I, including marijuana. "I think the conversation minimizes the harm," an uncomfortable Botticelli replied. "I'm not trying to minimize the harm," Representative Blumenauer said. "I just want to know what's more dangerous and addictive." "You don't know?" As a public health person, one of the things that we look at is not the relative risk of one drug against another, Botticelli claimed. Representative Blumenauer, looking very unhappy, then said, "Let me just say that your equivocation right there, being unable to answer something clearly and definitively when there is unquestioned evidence to the contrary, is why young people don't believe the propaganda, why they think it's benign. If a professional like you can't answer clearly that meth is more dangerous than marijuana, which every kid on the street knows, which every parent knows, if you can't answer that, maybe that's why we're failing to educate people about the dangers," Blumenauer said. "I don't want kids smoking marijuana. I agree with the chairman. But if the deputy director of the Office of Drug Policy can't answer that question, how do you expect high school kids to take you seriously?" Botticelli tried to assure the congressman that he hadn't meant to be disrespectful or to suggest that there was no difference in toxicity between the three drugs. But Representative Blumenauer threw up his hands. "I asked what was more dangerous. You couldn't answer it," the congressman declared. "And I just want to say that you, sir, represent what's part of the problem. We've been able to drop tobacco use without being coercive. We've been using fact-based advertising, and we focused our efforts on things that matter rather than things that don't work," Blumenauer said. "I'd respectfully suggest that you and the department take a step back if you're concerned that somehow people think marijuana is benign. Part of the reason is that drug professionals can't communicate in ways the rest of America does." For those who have not yet seen the full video of the hearing on federal marijuana policy held by the House Oversight Committee's Subcommittee on Government Operations on Tuesday, it is a must-watch, according to Paul Stanford, publisher of Hemp News and director of its parent organization, the Campaign for the Restoration and Regulation of Hemp, CRRH. "None of the news reports do it justice," Stanford said. CBS ignored the bulk of the hearing, including especially the statements and questioning by Representatives Blumenauer and Cohen, about which the reform world has been abuzz. If you visit that story, Oregon Congressman blasts a drug official on his marijuana cluelessness on Hemp News. You can find a link to both halves of the video of that hearing, and it is worthwhile viewing. In Alaska this week, we learned that voters will get to decide on marijuana legalization this August. "North to the future" is Alaska's state motto, and the future is cannabis legalization, according to the polls. State voters will get a chance to have their say at the ballot box on August the 19th, after supporters collected enough signatures to qualify an initiative for the ballot. They have hit the magic numbers, said Alaska Elections Director Gail Finamai on Tuesday, reports Michelle Theriault-Boots at the Anchorage Daily News. The totals are still unofficial. The signature threshold was reached on Tuesday morning by Alaska's Campaign to Regulate Marijuana. Totals posted on the Alaska Division of Elections website showed 31,593 valid voter signatures had been counted. Tim Hinterberger and fellow Campaign to Regulate Marijuana backers submitted more than 46,000 signatures on January 8th. Alaska law requires 30,000 valid signatures to qualify. Initiative backers also met the requirement to gather signatures from at least 30 of the state's 40 House districts. The effort is co-sponsored by Hinterberger, Bill Parker, a former deputy commissioner in the Alaska Department of Corrections, and Mary Ruff. If voters approve the measure, Alaska will become the third state in the union after Colorado and Washington to legalize cannabis for recreational use. Backers modeled this ballot initiative, in fact, after Colorado's Amendment 64, the legalization law under which retail marijuana stores opened on January 1st, and which taxes and regulates cannabis similarly to alcohol. Alaska voters back in 2000 rejected marijuana legalization by 18 percentage points. In 2004, another legalization measure was defeated by 11 points. Medical marijuana was approved by voters in 1998 by 18 percentage points. Workers must examine the 5,000 remaining signatures, and Lieutenant Governor Meade Treadwell must sign certification paperwork, and those steps are expected to happen next week. Attitudes toward marijuana have softened in recent years in Alaska, as in the rest of the nation. Alaskans are already allowed to have as much as 4 ounces of cannabis for personal use in their homes, resulting from a 1975 state Supreme Court ruling citing the right to privacy, which is very strong in the Alaska Constitution. Just 30% of Alaskans said marijuana should be decriminalized in a 2004 poll. By 2010, that number had jumped to 43% when they were asked about legalization, not just decrim. Then last year, public policy polling found that 54% of state voters favor legalization. There has been a phenomenal change, according to Ivan Moore, the pollster. The Campaign to Regulate Marijuana is mostly funded by the Washington, D.C.-based Marijuana Policy Project, which is given $1,000 in cash and $3,757 in services and in-kind donations, according to the Alaska Public Offices Commission. 4 individual donors had kicked in an additional $1,800 as of January 11th. Most of the campaign's energy so far has been spent on gathering signatures, according to Taylor Bickford, an employee of Seattle-based Strategies 360, a PR firm that's managing the initiative effort. Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM, a national anti-weed group headed by Patrick Kennedy, has said it plans to campaign against the ballot initiative. Smart Approaches to Marijuana has been approached by Alaska activists who don't want to see the safety problems and burdensome government regulations that would come with legalization, bullshitted spokesman Kevin Sabet in a Tuesday email. I don't think Alaskans are going to have a member of the Kennedy family from the East Coast telling us how to live our lives, Bickford said. Alaskans are watching other states, and they understand that the sky isn't falling, Bickford said. The effect has been that money that was benefiting criminal enterprises and drug dealers is being used to benefit the residents of the state. In Missouri this week, we have a lawmaker filing a marijuana legalization bill in the legislature. A state lawmaker has filed a bill that will legalize and tax marijuana in Missouri, which has some of the harshest pot laws in the nation. Representative Chris Kelly, a Democrat from Columbia, Missouri, filed House Bill 1659, which would impose a 25% tax on marijuana at the wholesale level, and it would set up a system of state licensing for growers and sellers. Kelly told the Huffington Post that his experience as a circuit judge changed his position on marijuana legalization. I saw a lot of marijuana cases, he said. Each county in Missouri would be allowed to have 1 retailer per 2,500 residents under the plan. That would give St. Louis County 400 marijuana stores, with 127 in the city of St. Louis itself. The bill would allow adults to possess and transport a pound of cannabis, a pound of hashish, and more than a half a gallon of hash oil. The language of the measure was lifted from one of 13 petitions filed by Dan Vietz, a Columbia-based attorney who serves as chairman of the legalization advocacy group Show Me Cannabis. To qualify for the ballot, any of those 13 petitions would need almost 158,000 signatures by May. Kelly's bill hasn't yet been sent to a committee. He said he isn't optimistic the bill will pass the legislature, but he hopes to start a dialogue. Kelly said he planned to add a referendum clause to the bill, meaning that voters will have to approve it after lawmakers pass it. There's no way you could pass it straight through the legislature, Kelly said, but they might let the people decide. Currently in Missouri, just one joint can get you up to a year in prison, even on the first offense. About 20,000 people were arrested for marijuana in Missouri in 2011. More than 90% of those were for simple possession, according to the Marijuana Policy Project. The billions of dollars we spent on the war on drugs has probably not stopped one person from smoking one joint, Kelly said. And it's ruined the lives of tens of thousands of people. And the question is, for what? A September 2012 poll found a majority of Missouri residents favor legalizing, taxing, and regulating marijuana like alcohol. In Oklahoma this week, we have another marijuana legalization bill introduced. It was roundly ignored by the GOP there. This bill, introduced in the Oklahoma State Senate to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes for adults 21 and older. Senator Connie Johnson introduced Senate Bill 2116, which would legalize, tax, and regulate cannabis similarly to alcohol. By taxing and regulating marijuana, we can take the lucrative market out of the hands of criminals and drug cartels and put it in the hands of tax-paying, law-abiding businesses, according to Senator Johnson. She points out that marijuana prohibition diverts the attention of law enforcement away from more serious crimes. More importantly, we can stop arresting adults simply for using a substance less harmful than alcohol and focus our law enforcement resources on violent crimes and real threats to public safety, she said. As taxpayers, we're spending over $30 million each year policing, jailing, and incarcerating our citizens on marijuana-related offenses. Yet marijuana is almost universally available. It's time for a smarter approach, according to Senator Johnson. This is her fourth try to introduce this legislation, but she thinks it could have a better chance this time due to social media. The citizens want to be heard on this issue, she said. Getting that message out and that word going, getting people calling their legislators, calling the people that are in positions of power. A hearing on the science of marijuana will be held on Wednesday, February 11th by the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Select Agencies. Marijuana advocates plan to spend the day talking to their elected officials about the proposal. Telephone calls won't make any difference, apparently, because he's going to ignore them, says one GOP senator in a position to block the bill. Marijuana won't be legal anytime soon in the Sooner State, according to State Senator Don Barrington, a Republican from Lawton, Oklahoma. Unfortunately, Senator Barrington has the power to refuse to hear it as chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Public Safety. Barrington claims Senate Bill 2116 is just another way to get marijuana legalized. He says a similar bill was introduced in last year's legislative session and voted down, and that's why he won't hear the bill in his subcommittee. When legislation is passed, there are unintended consequences, and I think the legislation I reviewed would lead to unintended consequences, Barrington claimed. I don't think parameters are put in place that can handle it. Barrington's phone number, 405-521-5563, has been ringing off the hook from constituents upset with his refusal to even hear the bill in his subcommittee. But he says all those calls and messages won't change his mind. I guess I'm a little confused here because I was under the impression that state senators are supposed to actually represent their constituents, not ignore them. It's my job as a committee chairman to review legislation, and I don't recall how many bills have been assigned to my committee this year, but it's to give hearing to those bills that support good legislation, Barrington claimed. So if Don Barrington says marijuana legalization is bad legislation, it apparently doesn't matter what his constituents think. In the District of Columbia this week, the D.C. Council voted to decriminalize marijuana and end marijuana possession arrests. The bill that they approved would reduce enormous racial disparities in the criminal justice system, according to experts. Unfortunately, some last-minute amendments weakened the bill. Advocates warned that the public consumption provision in it will perpetuate more unfair and costly arrests. In any event, they took a major step towards decriminalizing marijuana on Tuesday in the nation's capital. They voted 11-1 in favor of a bill that would eliminate all criminal penalties for the possession of 1 ounce or less of marijuana and treat possession of it as a civil offense. The council takes a final vote on the bill in early March. It's expected to pass and to be signed into law by the mayor. It's viewed by both council members and advocates as a model for other jurisdictions to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system. This is a major victory for advancing the cause of racial justice in D.C., according to Grant Smith, who's policy manager with the Drug Policy Alliance. The war on marijuana is largely a war on people of color, and the D.C. Council is saying enough is enough. The Marijuana Possession Decriminalization Amendment Act of 2014 would eliminate the threat of arrest for possessing marijuana and ensure that people are no longer saddled with lifelong convictions that make it difficult to obtain employment and housing. Instead of arresting people, the bill would impose a $25 civil fine for possession, as well as forfeiture of the marijuana and any paraphernalia used to consume or carry it. Advocates, though, expressed dismay that an amendment approved during consideration of the bill would treat so-called public consumption of marijuana as a criminal offense, punishable by up to 60 days in jail and/or a $500 fine. Last year, the ACLU and the Washington Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights and Urban Affairs released groundbreaking reports showing that enormous racial disparities exist in arrests for marijuana possession in D.C. These reports found that the majority of all drug arrests in the district are for simple possession of marijuana, and that the vast majority of the thousands arrested every year in the district are African American. African Americans in D.C. are 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people, even though government surveys show that both groups use marijuana at similar rates. Social justice advocates, faith leaders, and members of the public have urged that this legislation protect residents of neighborhoods saturated with a heavy law enforcement from being unfairly and disproportionately subjected to arrest, police scrutiny, invasive searches, and the imposition of heavy fines that most white residents in affluent neighborhoods do not experience. Advocates urge that these policy goals are essential to changing and improving the relationship between the community and law enforcement. A poll conducted in April 2013 by Public Policy Polling and commissioned by the Drug Policy Alliance and the Marijuana Policy Project found that 3 out of 4 D.C. voters support changing district law to replace criminal penalties for possession of limited amounts of marijuana with a civil fine similar to a traffic ticket. A poll conducted in January by the Washington Post found that 63% of D.C. residents support not just decriminalizing marijuana, but also taxing and regulating it like alcohol. Recent national surveys by Gallup, Pew Research, CNN, CBS, and other outlets have found a majority of Americans support legally regulating the production and sale of marijuana. During Tuesday's consideration of the bill, council members accepted an amendment offered by Council Member Phil Mendelson. It criminalizes public consumption of marijuana, and this amendment stripped out the proposed $100 fine for smoking marijuana in public places that was approved by the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety last month. An amendment was passed which unfortunately makes the odor of marijuana a reasonable cause for police to search a vehicle. Advocates warn that treating public consumption of marijuana as a criminal offense weakens the effectiveness of the bill to end the mass arrests of people of color and poor residents of D.C. A civil fine allows the city to punish and deter people who consume marijuana in public. Criminalizing public consumption, however, means people will be arrested, possibly may lose their jobs, and will be saddled with lifelong convictions. We urge the council to consider making public consumption a civil fine instead of a criminal offense, said the DPA's Grant Smith. We can deter people from smoking marijuana in public without arresting them and branding them with a conviction that will make it difficult for them to find employment. This bill should end racial disparities, not perpetuate them. As a former prosecuting attorney, I call this a step forward for the cause of promoting public safety, said Dan Riffle, Director of Federal Policies at the Marijuana Policy Project. Arresting and prosecuting adults for possessing a less harmful substance than alcohol is a waste of law enforcement and court resources. Police and prosecutors should focus their time and attention on addressing actual threats to public safety. We need to regulate and tax marijuana like alcohol and take it out of the hands of criminals and drug cartels, Riffle said. Marijuana should be sold by legitimate businesses and licensed, regulated stores, not by criminals on our street corners. The sooner the council takes up the council member Grosso's bill, the better, Riffle said. Finally, this week in Turkey, a very interesting archaeological discovery. A piece of 9,000-year-old hemp fabric was found. Archaeological excavations in Turkey revealed the 9,000-year-old hemp linen fabric in the ground at the site of a burned house. The fabric was wrapped around the skeleton of a baby. The dig in the central Anatolian province of Konya at the settlement of Catalhuyuk is being called one of the most important finds of 2013. More than 120 people from 22 countries worked on the excavations. The fire warmed up the ground and platforms of the building and created a kiln drying effect, according to Professor Ian Hodder of Stanford University. Therefore, the pieces and this piece of cloth underground have been so far protected. Examinations in the laboratory show that this piece of cloth is linen weaved with hemp, according to Professor Hodder. He says it's the first in the world and one of the best preserved examples. This piece of linen, which is weaved very thin, most probably came from the Eastern Mediterranean, Hodder said. It is already known that obsidians and seashells had been exchanged in long-distance trade in the Middle East during the Neolithic era, but this fabric may have revealed another side of the trade involving hemp. Before we go this week, let's take a look quickly at a must-read story from Jeremy Webb, who is a medical marijuana patient who lives in Seattle. The story is called The Hash Adventures, or How I Learned to Relax and Love My Medicine. You can find that on Toke Signals. And Jeremy tells us how he became a medical marijuana patient and how he became accustomed to using hash oil for his medicine, including the early difficult period of adjustment when the oil was having strong psychoactive effects on him. It's a very entertaining read, and you can find that at tokesignals.com. I hope you choose to join us again next week for the next edition of Toke Signals. Send in those pretty bud pics. I always like the pics of pretty flowers, and maybe your pic can be a star. We'll see you next time. Until then, stay lifted.